Greetings, my awesome viewer. From which city and country are you watching today? Maybe you're in a peaceful small town or a bustling capital. Type it in the comments. And don't forget to share this video with those you care about. It helps a ton. Let's go. David's fingers tightened around the handle of his carry-on bag as he navigated the busy passageways of JFK International Airport. The early evening lights gleamed off the polished floors, casting sharp reflections as streams of travelers hurried by with intent in their eyes. He had just returned from a week in Chicago, where he'd been deep in negotiations with a key client, representing the architectural firm that counted on his expertise. At 35, David Carter had built a solid reputation, known for his meticulous work ethic and unwavering commitment to quality. Now his only desire was to get back home to his wife, Marie, fill her in on the progress of the deal, and enjoy a quiet evening free from boardrooms and business dinners. As he made his way toward baggage claim, he slipped into the current of arriving passengers, indistinguishable from the crowd. When he reached the carousel, he slid a hand into his pocket and retrieved his phone. A message from Marie illuminated the screen. "Can't wait to see you. Love you." David's lips curled into a faint smile as he began typing a response. But before he could hit send, a voice sounded behind him. "David? David Carter, is that you?" It was a woman's voice, touched with surprise. Turning toward it, he saw someone vaguely familiar, though he couldn't immediately place where he knew her from. She looked to be around his age, with stylishly cropped ash-blonde hair and clear blue eyes that lit up with recognition. Sensing his hesitation, she chuckled lightly. "You probably don't remember me," she said, offering her hand. "I'm Emma Raines. I went to college with Marie." A flicker of recognition crossed his face as her name registered. "Oh, Emma, right," he said, shaking her hand with a courteous smile. "Marie's mentioned you before." "She has?" Emma asked, momentarily surprised before regaining her composure with an easy smile. "I saw your wedding photos on Facebook. That's how I recognized you." David let out a small, self-deprecating laugh. "I'm awful at putting names to faces, especially out of context." He glanced around the busy terminal. "How about you? Coming or going?" "Headed to Dallas," she replied. "Work trip. My flight leaves in about an hour." She studied him for a second. "You're living in New York now, right?" "Yeah, we moved a little while ago," he said. "I'm working out of the city. Just got back from a project meeting in Chicago." His eyes drifted toward the carousel again, still no sign of his suitcase. With time to kill, he turned his attention back to her. "Funny running into you here. Marie will be happy to hear I saw you." At the mention of Marie's name, Emma's smile held, but for the briefest moment, something shadowed her expression. Hesitation, maybe, or a flash of emotion he couldn't quite identify. It passed in a heartbeat, replaced by casual interest. "How's Marie doing these days? I haven't seen her in ages." "She's good," David replied. "Busy as always. She's up for a promotion at the nonprofit she's been with." "That's really great to hear," Emma said warmly. Then she paused, her tone shifting slightly as she added, "I always wondered what happened with her. You know, after everything." David's forehead creased just a bit. "After everything?" he repeated. David was taken aback by Emma's comment. As far as he knew, there was nothing particularly noteworthy about Marie's life before he entered it. That was always the impression she had given, intentionally or not. She was careful about revealing anything too personal, sticking to vague mentions and general statements. She'd once told him that she'd moved around frequently and gone through some tough times, but she preferred not to dwell on them. David hadn't pried. He assumed she'd faced the typical challenges that came with growing up, maybe a difficult breakup, perhaps some instability during her early adult years. But now Emma's words gave him pause. "Sorry, what do you mean by everything?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Emma's face shifted slightly, like she realized she might have said too much. Her lips parted as if to take it back. "Oh, nothing serious," she said quickly. "We just kind of lost touch after college." She added, "I remember she was going through a rough patch at the time." "A rough patch?" David echoed, now visibly intrigued. That detail was unfamiliar. Marie had never brought up anything specific. He knew she'd had a few job changes in her 20s, but that was hardly uncommon. Emma gave a casual shrug, clearly trying to downplay the subject. You know how life is, she said breezily. Plans fall apart, people drift, relationships end, just regular stuff. There was a brief silence as she looked away for a second, then met his eyes again. But she seems to be doing well now. It's really good to see. She deserves that. David felt a strange combination of reassurance and uneasiness. He considered pressing further, but before he could, the conveyor belt gave a loud mechanical shudder and luggage began to spill out. He spotted his suitcase, a black roller bag with a neon green strap knotted around the handle, and pointed it out. That one's mine, he said. Better grab it. Of course, Emma said, stepping aside. With a bit of effort, David lifted the suitcase from the belt and set it down beside him. He turned back to her, reluctant to let the topic drop just yet. There was something about the way she'd spoken earlier, something in her tone when she mentioned Marie's past, that stuck with him. A rough patch. Broken relationships. Was there someone in particular she'd been talking about? Maybe an ex? Marie had never gone into detail about her past relationships. Then again, David had never asked. I should probably get going, Emma said, adjusting the strap of her tote bag over her shoulder. It was really nice running into you. Tell Marie I said hi. I will, David replied with a polite nod. A quick glance at his watch reminded him that his car was parked in short term and time was running out if he wanted to avoid a hefty fee. Safe trip to Dallas. Maybe once you're back we could all get together for dinner. Marie would like that. Emma's smile faltered for a brief second, barely noticeable, but David caught it. She seemed about to say something, paused, then nodded. Yeah, that sounds good, she said. But her tone didn't quite line up with her words. There was a subtle hesitation, a kind of distance, as though she didn't fully believe it would happen. She cleared her throat and then added, Actually, before you head out, have you ever heard from any of Marie's old friends? Her gaze sharpened, more focused now. Like Alice? Or Trevor? The question took David by surprise. He searched his memory for names Marie might have mentioned. Alice rang a bell. He thought Marie had had a college roommate by that name. But Trevor? That name didn't sound familiar at all. Trevor? He repeated, the name foreign on his tongue. His mind raced, trying to make a connection. Could Trevor be short for Trevor? A colleague? A former boyfriend? He couldn't recall Marie ever mentioning anyone by that name. I don't think I know Trevor, he said eventually. Was he close to her? For a moment, Emma looked like she regretted bringing it up. Her smile turned stiff, her expression unreadable. Oh, just an old acquaintance. Nothing worth delving into. Emma brushed the subject aside with a dismissive wave, as if banishing a memory she had no interest in entertaining. I should head out. They're starting to board my flight. Her sudden pivot in conversation only sharpened David's intrigue, though it was evident she wasn't going to elaborate. He inclined his head slowly, recognizing the unmistakable edge in her voice that signaled the end of discussion. Of course, didn't mean to keep you. Nice meeting you, David, she said, her tone warm but measured. And take care, she added with a soft smile. Still, behind her expression, something flickered, a trace of discomfort that passed without explanation. She offered a final polite nod before turning away, wheeling her compact suitcase behind her as she disappeared into the flow of departing passengers. David stayed where he was, standing beside the nearly deserted baggage carousel, a furrow forming between his brows. Outwardly, their interaction had been cordial, courteous exchanges, easy smiles, yet there was a subtle gravity to the moment that lingered with him. He kept replaying the subtle shift in Emma's demeanor when he'd brought up dinner. The pause in her voice when she referenced someone named Trevor from Marie's past. It felt as though she had stopped just short of revealing something more, like the outline of a larger truth hiding just beneath the surface. He reminded himself not to overanalyze a brief airport chat, but the same intuition that helped him catch imperfections in blueprints now stirred uneasily within him. Who was this Trevor? Why had the mention of him seemed to unnerve her? What kind of rough time had she nearly spoken of? Marie had never mentioned a Trevor, not once, nor had she ever hinted at any deep turmoil in her past beyond the usual ups and downs life throws at everyone. As David made the drive home from the airport, those thoughts continued to circle his mind, looping again and again. By the time his car rolled into the driveway of their home in Westchester County, the sky had dimmed to evening, and the dashboard clock glowed just before 8 p.m. Soft light glimmered from the windows of their two-story house, a welcoming sight after being away. When David stepped through the front door, the comforting aroma of home enveloped him. A burst of tomato, the freshness of basil, a hint of garlic. Marie must have warmed up the pasta she'd mentioned earlier on the phone. Their orange tabby whiskers trotted over, meowing his familiar greeting. David stooped to scoop him up with one arm, rolling his suitcase inside with the other. "I'm back," he called cheerfully, his voice echoing through the house as he shut the door. He heard quick footsteps approaching from the kitchen, and moments later Marie appeared, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. To David, she looked effortlessly beautiful. Her chestnut hair was loosely tied up, and she wore a cozy teal sweater over her jeans. Simple, easy, hers. Her hazel eyes brightened as soon as they landed on him. "Welcome home," she said with a wide smile, hurrying across the hardwood to wrap her arms around him. He held her tightly, inhaling the familiar scent of her perfume, mixed with the warmth of dinner in the air. After a long moment, she pulled back just enough to press a soft kiss to his lips. "I missed you," she murmured, her forehead resting against his. "Missed you more," David replied gently, his voice wrapped in affection. His hands stayed on her waist, grounding him in the solid, safe feeling of being home with her. Here, in her embrace, the unease stirred by his earlier conversation began to fade, at least for the moment. Then he remembered the unsent text he'd been meaning to finish. Grinning, he said, "Got your message. Love you more." Marie let out a laugh, light and lilting. "Hey, I was saving that one for when you walked in the door." They chuckled quietly together before she grabbed one of his bags, helping him carry it into the front hallway. Soon after, they were settled on the living room couch, curled up together, each with a plate of warm carbonara in hand, comfort returning like a familiar old song. The television played softly in the background, its muted news segment going unnoticed. Both were too absorbed in the comfort of being together again. David shared stories from his recent business trip to Chicago, describing how his major presentation had gone off without a hitch, and how the client had been thrilled with his blueprint for the upcoming office complex downtown. Marie listened closely, her face glowing with pride, offering him gentle affirmations at just the right moments. He had always valued that about her, the way she genuinely cared about his work, how she never failed to celebrate his achievements, no matter how trivial they seemed. When he wrapped up his stories from the road, Marie began recounting things on the home front. She talked about her latest projects at the nonprofit, a silly incident involving their cat knocking over a plant while chasing specks of dust, and a new spinach quiche recipe she was excited for him to try. It was one of those peaceful, intimate conversations that felt so natural, quiet, familiar, and comforting. Even as they laughed and shared, David's mind kept circling back to the brief, unsettling moment at the airport. A name, Trevor, kept surfacing in his memory, tied to the vague remarks someone had made about Marie's complicated past. He wasn't sure if he should bring it up now or wait until the timing felt better. He didn't want to ruin a tender evening over something that might not be important at all. And yet, part of him couldn't ignore the nagging feeling. What if it was important? He looked at Marie just as she laughed at something he'd said, her eyes creasing in that endearing way he loved so much. Could she really be hiding something from him? Their entire relationship had been founded on trust, or so he had always believed. Then again, didn't everyone have chapters they preferred to keep closed? Was it possible hers held more weight than she had ever let on? In the end, David decided against pressing the issue. He'd wait, he told himself. Maybe tomorrow, when the mood was calmer and time felt more generous. There was no need to stir up doubts tonight. Sliding an arm around her, he leaned back with her into the softness of the couch. For now, he just wanted to savor the feeling of being home, held by the ease of her presence. unaware that a hairline crack had already begun to form beneath the surface of their seemingly seamless life. Chapter 2. A Quiet Shift. Golden morning light streamed in through the kitchen window as David filled his mug with fresh coffee. It was one of those crisp autumn Saturdays when the trees outside looked ablaze with shades of amber and scarlet. Normally, weekends were made for lingering in bed, making pancakes, or wandering lazily through the park. But today, David had risen with the sun, unable to rest with his thoughts in disarray. He was still unsettled by the conversation he'd had at the airport. Emma's passing comment kept replaying in his mind. At the stove, Marie hummed softly to herself, stirring scrambled eggs in a pan. She looked like she always did on relaxed mornings, content, easygoing, dressed in cozy yoga pants and one of his oversized flannel shirts she loved to borrow. Watching her, David felt a twinge of guilt, even for silently doubting her. Maybe he was overthinking everything, but deep down he knew he needed answers. "I bumped into someone at the airport yesterday," he said, his tone casual as he settled onto a stool by the island. "Yeah?" Marie glanced back, her expression open and curious. "Someone I'd know?" "Emma Raines," David said, watching her closely. "She mentioned you two were in college together." There was the slightest pause in Marie's movements, barely perceptible, but he noticed. Her stirring faltered for a split second before she picked it back up, her back still turned, her posture a little more rigid. "Emma, wow," she said after a brief silence, her voice light but tinged with surprise. "It's been forever since I've thought about her." "She seemed genuinely pleased to hear how well you're doing," David went on, lifting his mug. "She asked if we'd kept in touch with anyone. She mentioned a few names, Alice, and someone named Trevor." This time Marie's reaction was more pronounced. Her body stiffened, subtly but unmistakably. Though she quickly recovered and focused on plating their breakfast, David had already seen it. When she turned and placed their plates on the counter, her face was composed, measured. "Well, that's a surprise," she remarked as she set the plate in front of him. "I haven't really kept in touch with many people from back then." David nodded slowly, murmuring his appreciation before deciding to press gently. "Yeah, I kinda guessed that. Emma hinted things got a little rough for you after college. Didn't really elaborate, though." Marie sat down across from him, both hands encircling her coffee mug like it was a source of warmth. The soft morning light poured through the window, catching on her face and lending her a weary look. She gave a quick laugh, but it sounded brittle and forced. "Did she now?" "I'm sure she meant well," she said, brushing it off. "Those years weren't easy, just the usual career stuff, you know." She took a sip of her drink, as if to punctuate the subject. David vaguely recalled her bringing up job changes when they first started dating, something about switching roles frequently, but she had never gone into detail. At the time, he had assumed it was just part of the post-college shuffle. "Yeah," he said evenly, "work stuff." Then, in a deliberately offhand tone, he added, "And what about Trevor? Don't think I've heard you mention him before." For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, almost like panic. Her fingers started to toy with the mug's handle. "Trevor?" she echoed too quickly. "He was just some guy we all knew in school. Not close to me or anything, probably one of Emma's friends. Just a name from way back." The reply came too fast, too uneven. It raised a red flag. "Honestly," she added, picking up her fork, "I barely even remember him." And with that, she turned her attention to her breakfast, effectively closing the door on the conversation. David moved his food around his plate, appetite fading. Her answers had been vague, dodging even. He recognized the signs. She clearly didn't want to revisit Trevor, or that difficult stretch after college. But why? If Trevor was nothing more than a familiar face from their university days, why did his name jolt her like that? A weighty silence settled over the kitchen, broken only by the dull clatter of silverware. David studied her in that hush. Though she stared at her meal, she didn't seem to really see it. He guessed she was mentally replaying the conversation, trying to pinpoint exactly what Emma might have shared. After a few tense minutes, Marie pivoted. She brought up his recent trip to Chicago again, then started talking about a new initiative her non-profit was launching. David replied, but without the earlier spark. His mind was elsewhere, fixated on the dissonance between her words and her reactions. When the meal ended, Marie stood, muttering about taking a shower before heading out to pick up groceries. The moment she left the room, David exhaled, only then realizing he'd been holding his breath. He pressed his fingers to his temples, trying to ease the tightness that had crept into his shoulders. His gut had warned him the night before. There was more to Marie's past than she let on. As he began to clear the table, his mind churned. Maybe he was reading too much into it, imagining shadows where none existed. But her behavior this morning didn't fit with someone who had nothing to conceal. He thought back to moments he had once dismissed. How there were no photos from her 20s. She always said she wasn't the type to document her life. How she skirted over the years between college and their meeting, only ever referencing them in broad terms about jobs and transitions. How none of her close friends dated back to that era. They all came later. He used to think it was just the normal drifting that comes with time and change. Now it felt deliberate. The most compassionate theory his mind offered was that something traumatic had happened, a bad relationship, maybe something worse. If that were true, he could understand her silence. He wouldn't blame her for guarding herself. If someone had hurt her, he'd be the first to stand by her, even confront the person if it came to that. But she hadn't confided in him. She'd kept it sealed away. And that pointed to something deeper, something she was afraid he might discover. Not just pain she didn't want to relive, but fear about how he might respond if he knew the truth. That possibility gnawed at him. He loved Marie, truly. They had built a life together. They were even talking about having kids within the next year or so. But now, that life felt like it was built around a silence neither of them had dared to break. Trust had always been the bedrock of their relationship, or at least, that's what he'd believed. But recently, a quiet disquiet had crept in, suggesting that maybe he hadn't truly known Marie as intimately as he'd once assumed. As she prepared to leave for the grocery store, David had already resolved on a course of action. He needed answers. If Marie wasn't ready to offer them willingly, he'd have to uncover them himself, with care. His motivation wasn't born of suspicion, but of a deep desire to understand the lingering presence from her past that still seemed to shape her present. That hidden history had already begun to introduce a fine fracture in their trust. Left unaddressed, he feared it would only deepen. "I'm heading out for a bit, too," he said lightly as Marie reached for her keys. "Might swing by the hardware store, maybe stop at the library." "Okay," she said, brushing a kiss against his cheek. Her smile was present, but there was a faint remoteness in her eyes that unsettled him. "See you soon." "Love you." "Love you too," David replied, watching as she stepped outside. His words were sincere, yet their weight was tinged with unease. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, he headed upstairs to his office. Sinking into the chair at his desk, he powered up his laptop, his heart heavy with a mixture of uneasiness and determination. Prying into Marie's past without her knowledge felt like a violation, but remaining in ignorance felt worse. He began with what he knew. Typing in her maiden name, along with her college and the city she'd moved to afterward, he started searching. He scrolled through social media, checked public records, followed any leads he could find. Most of it was already familiar to him. Her LinkedIn profile, which he'd browsed in the past, outlined a vague career path. Short stints in marketing, a few admin positions. Nothing jumped out as concerning. Thinking he needed a new angle, David began including the name Trevor in his searches, hoping for some kind of link to Marie. But without a last name, the results were frustratingly broad and mostly useless. One Facebook post caught his attention. A man named Trevor had left a comment on a reunion thread tied to Marie's old college. Still, nothing in the post indicated a connection between them. With a sigh, David realized he wasn't going to find what he needed by blindly searching. He needed someone who actually knew something. Emma had clearly held back during their brief and uncomfortable exchange at the airport. Perhaps if he approached her again, calmly and without catching her off guard, she'd be willing to share more. At the very least, she could steer him in the right direction. Feeling a new sense of resolve, David found the business card she'd handed him the day before. She had passed it along casually, suggesting they keep in touch. He hadn't even really looked at it until now. Thankfully, he'd held on to it. The card listed Emma as a project manager at a tech company and included her cell number. His palms were slick with nerves as he dialed. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. "Hello?" Emma's voice came through, surprised and slightly wary. "Hi, Emma. It's David. David Carter," he said, immediately feeling foolish for repeating his full name. "Oh, hi, David," she said, pausing. "Is everything all right?" Yes, everything's fine," he said quickly, the words tumbling out too fast. He forced himself to pause and take a steadying breath. "I hope it's okay that I called. I used the number from your card. I wanted to follow up on what you mentioned yesterday, if that's all right." A silence lingered between them for a beat. Emma hesitated before answering, her voice controlled and deliberate. "I understand. Did you try having a conversation with Marie about it?" "I did," David said with a sigh. "But she didn't say much. Honestly, she got upset that I even brought it up. I could tell it struck a nerve, but she shut down instead of talking about it." On the other end of the line, Emma let out a faint breath. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler, troubled. "David, I don't know if it's really my place to explain. Marie's a dear friend. I never wanted to be the cause of tension between you two." "I know," he said quickly, hoping to ease her worry. He paced his office restlessly, occasionally glancing toward the window to make sure Marie hadn't returned yet. "I love her, Emma, I truly do, and I'm concerned. About her. About us. If there's something painful in her past she's hiding, I need to know what it is. Not to judge, but to be there for her, to understand where she's coming from." There was another pause, followed by the sound of Emma inhaling deeply, clearly struggling with what to say. She was weighing her loyalty against David's plea, torn between the two. Eventually, her resolve settled into her voice. "All right," she said. "I'll tell you what I can, but not over the phone. This needs to be in person. I'll be back from Dallas tomorrow morning, and I've got a window in the afternoon before I head home. Can we meet then?" Relief flooded through David, though it carried a thread of dread with it. "Yes, of course. Just tell me where and when." They agreed on a quiet cafe tucked away in Midtown Manhattan. When David hung up, a heaviness settled in his chest. This was the moment. Answers were coming, answers he'd longed for, but he wasn't sure he was ready for them. That evening, David was quieter than usual. Marie noticed. As they moved around the kitchen preparing dinner, she kept throwing him concerned glances. He forced a few tired smiles, blaming work pressure and feigning fatigue to excuse an early bedtime. But sleep eluded him. Lying in bed beneath the sheets, he stared blankly at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled in what-ifs and half-formed fears. Beside him, Marie slept fitfully, restless in a way that suggested she could feel the subtle shift in him, though she might not have understood the reason why. Chapter 3. The Weight of Truth. Sunday arrived, draped in a dull shroud of gray. David sat alone at a small table near the window of a quiet midtown cafe, his leg bouncing anxiously beneath the table. He had arrived a full half-hour early. Waiting at home had been unbearable. The coffee he ordered sat untouched, now lukewarm. When the bell above the door chimed, he looked up sharply. Emma walked in, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on him. She approached with a cautious smile, and this time, with the advantage of time and expectation, David noticed how drawn she looked. Her eyes were shadowed, and her face bore the fatigue of a sleepless night. "Hi, David," she said quietly, sliding into the chair opposite him. "Hi, Emma. Thanks for meeting me," he replied, trying to offer a smile, though it didn't quite land. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Tea?" She shook her head. "No, I'm all right. I can't stay too long. I've got a flight soon. But I didn't want to have this talk over the phone." David nodded. He appreciated that more than he could say. They sat in silence for a few moments before Emma exhaled and folded her hands, bracing herself. "I owe you an apology," she began slowly. "I never should have said anything back at the airport. It wasn't my place. But when I saw you, realized you had no idea, I was caught off guard." David's voice was even, though the knot in his stomach was tightening. Didn't know what? Whatever Emma was about to reveal, he knew it would shift something fundamental. Her gaze dropped to her hands as she nervously twisted a silver ring around her finger. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but quiet. David, Marie hasn't been fully honest about her past. There are things you don't know, things that matter. David felt his throat constrict, but he managed to get the words out. This is about someone named Trevor, isn't it? Or Trevor? Emma looked up, her expression solemn as she gave a slow nod. Yes, Trevor Sanders. Hearing the name felt like a jolt of electricity racing through David's body. Trevor Sanders? He locked it into his mind instantly. Who is that? Emma held his gaze, her eyes full of quiet sympathy. That was Marie's first husband, she said gently. Even though David had feared something along these lines, the reality of hearing it aloud struck him like a punch to the gut. He felt the blood drain from his face. Her husband? He echoed, barely managing the words. She was married before me? She was, Emma confirmed in a hushed tone. We were all in our 20s back then. It happened fast, one of those all-consuming relationships that burn hot and quick. They got married within a year of meeting. None of us saw it coming. David opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He was blindsided. Marie, his Marie, married once before, and he had never known? A storm of disbelief and hurt began rising inside him. Why would she keep something like that from me? Emma continued, her voice steady, knowing he needed the full picture. Soon after they got married, Trevor started a business, an investment company of some kind. I didn't know the details. I wasn't living nearby then. I only heard scattered updates. She hesitated before speaking again, her voice tinged with caution. But what matters is that about a year into their marriage, everything came crashing down. There was a scandal. His firm got caught up in a fraud case. A lot of people lost money, whether through mismanagement or worse. I never got the full story. David's mind reeled. Fraud? This wasn't some petty mistake. He pictured Marie now, the principled woman who worked for a non-profit, someone who seemed to live with sincerity and heart. This version of her past felt utterly alien. It was ugly, Emma said, her brow furrowed in remembrance. People were seriously hurt. Friends, neighbors, local investors. It even made the news for a while. And then, one day, Trevor just disappeared. Disappeared? David leaned forward, incredulous. You mean he went missing? Emma nodded slowly, her face grave. Gone. No trace. Some people thought he left the country. Others believed he might have faked his death. No one ever got a clear answer. The police looked into it, but as far as I know, they never found him. David dragged a hand through his hair, overwhelmed. Marie's ex-husband had been part of a financial scandal and then had simply vanished into thin air. It sounded like something out of a true crime novel, not the life of the woman he loved and trusted. He struggled to find the right words. And Marie? What happened to her? Emma's expression turned heavy with sadness. I wasn't close to her during that time, but from what I heard, it broke her. Of course, she was questioned, but the authorities never charged her. They believed she hadn't known what Trevor was doing. Still, that didn't stop the rumors. Everyone had something to say. David's voice was barely above a whisper. She must have been devastated. She was, Emma said with a nod. Trevor left her in ruins, emotionally, socially, and financially. It was a dark and painful chapter in her life. David felt his chest tighten, the sheer weight of everything crashing down on him. The image of Marie in that moment, left behind by her husband, his name disgraced, rumors rippling through their social circles, was deeply disturbing. Still, a persistent uncertainty tugged at David's thoughts. Had Marie ever hinted at knowing what Trevor had been tangled up in? Emma paused, gently biting her lower lip in hesitation. I'm really not sure, she confessed. We had started to drift apart by then, but I do remember hearing something from Alice. We were both close to her. She went on to explain that investigators had combed through Marie's finances and turned up nothing incriminating. There was no evidence connecting her to the scandal. Trevor had seemingly gone out of his way to ensure Marie's name was nowhere near anything that could link her to the case. Emma let out a quiet sigh, her face growing somber. Afterward, Marie kind of shut down. Not in the same way Trevor vanished, but she left town. She severed nearly all connections. Even I only heard scattered bits. That she'd relocated, resumed using her maiden name. Eventually, someone said she'd ended up somewhere in the Northeast. She took a breath, then added, and then years later I happened upon her profile online. She had gotten remarried. To you. The words struck David like ice water. Marie had erased her history and rebuilt her life, with him as the cornerstone. Had their entire relationship been rooted in carefully chosen omissions? He remembered bringing up her past early in their relationship. She'd mentioned difficult experiences she preferred not to revisit. He'd respected her boundaries. After all, who didn't carry painful baggage? But never in his wildest thoughts did he imagine she had once been married to a man who disappeared under criminal suspicion. He became aware that Emma was studying him closely. His reaction must have said everything. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. She never told me any of this, he murmured. Not even a hint. I believe you, Emma replied softly. Marie always carried herself with a certain dignity. I think she made a choice to bury that chapter of her life completely, pretend it never happened. I get it, but it wasn't fair to you. David heard the compassion in her voice, but another emotion began to take hold within him, anger. He worked to keep his tone controlled. Why are you telling me this now? He asked. I mean, thank you for being honest, but you just dropped a bomb. You've told me my wife has been hiding something monumental. That's a lot, Emma. Her gaze fell to the table. I know, she said. It's something I debated for a long time. But then I saw you both, how real your love seemed, how happy you looked together. And it made me feel sick, knowing you didn't have the full picture. Staying silent didn't feel right anymore. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with things unspoken. David's thoughts raced, spinning in every direction. Pain, disbelief, fear for the woman he thought he truly understood, and a deepening need for clarity. I need to know more, he said at last. Do you have anything else? Any clue where Trevor went or whether there's more to the story than what you've told me? Emma slowly shook her head. I wish I did, she replied. But like I said, I wasn't close to the situation when it all went down. Everything I know is secondhand. There could still be remnants online, old news pieces or digital footprints that hadn't faded with time. Trevor Sanders, David repeated silently, committing the name to memory with quiet intensity. In a calm voice, he asked, Marie's original last name, was it Richardson? He found himself suddenly unsure. Had Cole been her maiden name when they met? Or was it an earlier married name, or something else entirely? When they were dating, she'd gone by Marie Cole. She later took his name, becoming Marie Carter. But now he was wondering, had Cole actually belonged to someone before him? That small uncertainty sent an unsettling ripple through him. Emma nodded, confirming. Yes, Richardson was her birth name. She took Trevor's surname, Sanders, when they got married. After he disappeared, she switched back to Richardson. That's the name she used right before you two met. On Facebook, she was Marie Richardson until she updated it to Marie Carter. That clarification offered David a touch of reassurance. At least the name she'd used while they were together hadn't been fabricated. It had come from somewhere real, her own past. But the realization that she'd kept an entire marriage hidden from him stirred a hollow ache. Thanks for being honest with me, he said, voice thick. I know this can't be easy for you. Emma reached out, placing her hand gently over his. Just don't rush to judge her before you let her explain, she said softly. I'm not defending what she did, but I think a part of her was scared, maybe ashamed. Still, I don't doubt that she truly loves you, David. A tightness formed in his throat, and he struggled to swallow it down. I love her too, he murmured eventually. Or, I loved who I thought she was. He paused, gaze falling to the table. No, that's not true. I still love her. I'm just trying to understand all of this. I get it, Emma said with quiet compassion, pulling her hand back. Whatever you decide to do, please be cautious. That whole thing with Trevor, if you start looking into it." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. David gave a slight nod, reading the unspoken warning in her expression. Moments later, Emma checked the time and stood. Her flight was coming up. David thanked her again, sincerely. They hugged, a little stiff, but genuine. When she was gone, David stayed at the table for a while longer, staring into the empty cup in front of him. The cafe buzzed softly around him, voices murmuring, steam hissing from the espresso machine, orders being called out. But David sat motionless in the center of it all, like time had slowed down just for him. Eventually he stood and walked out into the gray afternoon, the pavement damp beneath his shoes. He didn't go back to his apartment. Instead, some quiet instinct steered him toward the New York Public Library, not far from where he'd just been. Emma's words replayed in his mind. There might be articles. If there had been any kind of public scandal, it would have left a trace. Within half an hour, he was seated at one of the library's computers, navigating through digital archives. He tried every combination he could think of. Trevor Sanders fraud, Trevor Sanders disappearance, Sanders Ponzi scheme, Sanders embezzlement. The results came quickly. One headline jumped out at him from a small-town paper's digital vault, dated roughly 8 years earlier. "Financial advisor disappears amid criminal probe." He clicked. His pulse thudded in his ears as the article loaded. It detailed how Trevor Sanders, then just 29, had run a boutique investment firm that suddenly went under. Investigators suspected large-scale fraud, possibly a Ponzi scheme. He had vanished less than 2 days after a client filed a lawsuit, setting off a criminal investigation. A photo accompanied the article. A dark-haired man with angular features stood beside a younger Marie. They were both smiling, posed on the deck of a boat, champagne flutes in hand. The caption read, "Trevor Sanders and wife Marie left during happier times." David's stomach clenched as he stared at the image. Seeing Marie's face in an old news article tied to such a notorious scandal was like walking straight into a surreal nightmare. David's eyes flew over the screen, scanning each line with mounting urgency. The article made one thing clear. Marie Sanders hadn't been formally accused of anything. She had firmly denied having any knowledge of her husband's alleged criminal activity. Still, red flags dotted the report. Discrepancies in finances, missing funds, and a growing list of victims demanding answers. Another piece, dated months later, described the continuing manhunt for Trevor Sanders. Speculation had run rampant. Some thought he had escaped the country under a new name. Investigators had discovered that Trevor withdrew a large sum of money right before vanishing. Others suspected a tragic end, perhaps a botched attempt to flee by boat, had cost him his life. He had owned a small yacht, which was later discovered drifting, empty, just offshore. Some theories placed him as far away as South America. No definitive answer had ever emerged. It was as though Trevor Sanders had simply evaporated. David leaned back, scrubbing his hands over his face, his thoughts spiraling. What he'd read offered a strange confirmation. Emma's story had been supported by these details. But that clarity only gave way to new doubts that gnawed at him with sharper teeth. One question refused to let go. If no body had ever been found, was it possible Trevor was still alive? And if he was, had Marie known all along? David's thoughts returned to the money, the millions that had disappeared without a trace. If Trevor had stashed it somewhere and gone into hiding, had he ever tried to contact Marie? Worse, could she have been involved from the beginning? No, David told himself. He couldn't let speculation spiral into paranoia, not without facts. But facts were exactly what he intended to uncover. He folded the printed articles with care and tucked them into his coat before leaving the library, his mind set. He was going to dig into Marie's history until every last piece of the truth was exposed. And if Trevor Sanders was out there, anywhere, David was going to find him. No matter how unlikely that seemed, he needed to hear the truth for himself. Chapter 4. Digging Deeper. The following week dragged on with unbearable weight. David drifted through his job like a man underwater, present in body but absent in mind, going through motions while his thoughts raced elsewhere. At home, he worked hard to maintain the facade, pasting on a tired smile. But Marie wasn't fooled. He blamed his unease on stress from the Chicago project. Marie accepted the explanation, though not without hesitation. Her eyes followed him now, full of quiet wariness. Behind closed doors, David's every free moment was consumed by a single mission: tracking down Trevor Sanders. After Marie fell asleep each night, he sat alone, hunched over his laptop. He dove into digital records, obscure forums, and social media, chasing any scrap of information. The articles from the library were now spread across his desk, littered with his scribbled annotations and fluorescent highlights. He had flagged everything: names, dates, business contacts, anyone linked to Trevor in the reports. One name stood out: a former college friend who'd been briefly interviewed during the early investigation. A quick search brought up the man's LinkedIn profile. It didn't reveal much beyond a Florida address, but it was something. Another lead revolved around the yacht, referred to in media coverage as Sea Breeze. David began digging into boat registries, Coast Guard records, anything that might point to a new clue. But he kept hitting dead ends. Desperate, David decided to take a more creative risk. If Trevor had assumed a new identity, maybe he hadn't altered his appearance that drastically. He pulled up an old image from the news, a snapshot of Trevor and Marie aboard the yacht, and uploaded it to a reverse image search engine. The quality was poor, the faces small and blurry. Still, it was worth a try. To his surprise, the search turned up more than just recycled headlines. Most results led back to familiar territory, but one hit stood out. It directed him to a small-town newspaper site. There, buried among photos from a local charity event, was a man in the background, his face startlingly familiar. The grainy image showed a man older now, with a full beard, yet David couldn't shake the sense of recognition in the shape of his face or the look in his eyes. Beneath the photo, the caption read, "Trevor Stevens, local business owner." David's heart skipped a beat. Stevens. It was entirely feasible that Trevor had shortened his first name and assumed a new last one, still beginning with S. Maybe it was a coincidence, but David's gut told him otherwise. He clicked the link. The article outlined a community fundraiser in a small town called Greenport, nestled somewhere in the heart of Pennsylvania. Trevor Stevens was cited as the owner of a local landscaping company and one of the event's sponsors. Typing Trevor Stevens Greenport into a search engine brought up a bare-bones site for Stevens Landscaping. On the About page, a photo showed the proprietor beside a company truck. Though the man wore sunglasses and a baseball cap, his posture, the way he stood, only sharpened David's suspicions. He recognized that stance, that presence. Facial hair or not, hat or not, this was Trevor Sanders, hiding in the open. Greenport wasn't far. Just across the state border, about 5 hours away by car. David didn't waver. He knew what he had to do. He told Marie a story he invented on the spot. A potential client in Pennsylvania had reached out about a design consultation, and he had to check it out in person. The lie made him uneasy, but he reasoned it was justified. After all, Marie hadn't been entirely truthful either. He wasn't ready to confront her, not until he knew the entire story. At sunrise that Wednesday, David got in the car and headed out. The highway passed in a blur. Autumn leaves flamed in brilliant scarlet and amber along the roadside, but he barely noticed. His fingers clenched tighter on the wheel every time he rehearsed what he might say. How do you even start a conversation with the man who once shared vows with your wife? The man who disappeared, leaving behind a mess of questions that you didn't even know existed until it was too late? By the time the sun was dipping toward afternoon, David rolled into Greenport, a sleepy town tucked between forested slopes and gentle ridges. Finding the landscaping business didn't take long. It sat on the outskirts of town, enclosed by a chain-link fence and marked with a hand-painted wooden sign. Within the lot, several trucks and pieces of equipment were neatly arranged. David eased his car to a stop across the street. His pulse quickened. One of the garage bays stood open, and a man in worn coveralls knelt beside a piece of machinery. Even from a distance, David recognized the build, the rhythm of his movements. There was no question. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, crossing the road slowly. As he got closer, the features came into focus. Graying hair, the beard, signs of age, but the truth became undeniable. Trevor Sanders was alive. The man who now went by Trevor Stevens looked up from the engine, noticing David's approach. His ice-blue eyes met David's with a measured calm. "Need something?" he asked, his voice cool and professional. David's mouth went dry. He'd seen those eyes before, in a faded photograph buried in a dusty attic box labeled Marie, college years. Back then, he hadn't known who Trevor Sanders was. Now it was clear. "Trevor Sanders," David said quietly, his voice steady, watching for a flicker of recognition. The man froze. The wrench in his hand stopped mid-turn. His eyes darted briefly around the lot, scanning for witnesses. Tension coiled in his shoulders. "You've got the wrong guy," he replied, voice tight and cautious. David raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to cause trouble, I just want to talk, that's all." He nodded toward the open lot, exposed to passing cars and neighbors. "Can we go somewhere more private?" For a moment, Trevor said nothing. Then, with a small tilt of his head, he gestured toward the garage interior. "All right, come inside, but let's keep this quiet." David followed him through the open bay door. The air inside was thick with the smell of motor oil and cut grass. Trevor walked over to the entrance and pulled the bay door down halfway, creating a partial shield from prying eyes without plunging the room into darkness. Turning back to David, he crossed his arms firmly over his chest. As they stood facing one another, David noticed the sweat glistening on Trevor's forehead. It wasn't clear whether it came from physical effort or nervous energy. When Trevor finally spoke, his tone was low and cautious. "Who are you? Are you with law enforcement?" David shook his head, fast and certain. "Number, I'm not a cop." Trevor's eyes narrowed, suspicion rising. "Then what is this? Are you some kind of reporter? Why show up now, after all this time?" "I'm not with the press either," David replied, shaking his head once more. "My name's David Carter." He hesitated, steadying his voice. "I'm Marie's husband. Marie Richardson." The name drained the color from Trevor's face. He stared at David as if confronted by a ghost. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then slowly, Trevor let out a shaky breath and lowered himself onto an old wooden crate nearby, visibly rattled. "Marie's still alive?" he murmured, then let out a bitter, incredulous laugh. "Of course she is. I mean, is she okay? Did she move on?" David didn't sit. It felt strange trying to soothe this man. "From what I can tell, she's doing well," he answered. "She's healthy, has a career, a full life. We've been married for 2 years. Trevor rubbed his beard, his hand covering his mouth as he took that in. His eyes drifted out of focus. 2 years, he repeated softly. "And I'm guessing she never brought me up." David looked away, his jaw clenching. He stared at the floor, emotion tightening his throat. "No," he said, voice edged with frustration. "I only found out a few days ago. She kept everything hidden from me." Trevor gave a slow nod, his eyes closing, unsurprised. "Yeah," he muttered, voice heavy with bitterness. "Figures. After what happened, I wouldn't expect her to ever bring my name up again." David stepped closer, his voice even but urgent. "Trevor, or Trevor, whatever you go by, I'm not here to dig up the past just to hurt anyone. I want to understand. I know about the charges, the fraud, how you vanished, but Marie's part in it, that's still a blur." Something in Trevor shifted. His features hardened, the weight of anger and guilt surfacing in his eyes. "You want the truth?" he said, his voice turning icy. "The woman you married isn't the saint you think she is." David felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "I need to hear your side." Still seated, Trevor straightened, bracing himself. "You deserve to know. Not for her. She lost that right. But maybe for your sake." He sneered, the words cutting sharp. "She doesn't deserve my silence anymore." David's heart thudded in his chest. He steadied himself. "Tell me everything, from the beginning. The business. Whose idea was it? Trevor gave a short, bitter laugh. The business was mine. I had a background in financial advising, built up a small but solid clientele. I was ambitious, disciplined. But Marie... He paused, something flickering behind his gaze. She loved the lifestyle, the luxury, and I wanted to give her all of it. Big house, fancy cars, the kind of life we dreamed about. We were both young and greedy. He let out a breath, shaking his head. When the honest profits weren't coming fast enough, I got impatient, started dipping into client accounts, making risky trades to chase bigger returns. I told myself it was just temporary, that I'd fix it before anyone noticed. Regret crept into his voice, and for a while, it worked. Clients were thrilled. The money flowed, but I was just shifting funds around, borrowing from one to pay another, a textbook Ponzi scheme. And Marie? She wasn't in the dark, not even close. He leaned in, his expression hollow, voice quieter now. She managed the books, talked me down when I was on the edge. Honestly, sometimes I wonder if she didn't encourage it. If she wasn't just involved, but driving it alongside me. David stayed silent, every word weighing heavier than the last. The woman Trevor described felt like a stranger, but he didn't interrupt. He needed the truth, all of it. Trevor continued, his voice barely above a whisper. It all began to fall apart. One of our key backers got nervous and demanded a full withdrawal. He shook his head slowly. But we didn't have the money. Panic set in. Marie and I started arguing. She pushed to expand, bring in more players, try some bold last-ditch effort. I, on the other hand, thought it was time to face the truth and try to shut everything down quietly. He paused, his expression clouded. But we'd already gone too far. The client got suspicious. Eventually they went to the authorities. Trevor dropped his gaze, his shoulders heavy with remorse. I lost control, he muttered. And Marie? David asked carefully. She lost it, Trevor answered. Told me to fix what I'd broken. We had a brutal argument. He rubbed his forehead, fingers digging into his temples like he was chasing away an old ache. That's when it hit me. Her concern wasn't for us. It was for herself. His voice faltered. Maybe that's all it ever was. David's hands curled into fists at his sides. What did she do? Trevor lifted his eyes, the betrayal raw in his expression. She told me to take the fall, said if anyone came asking I should claim I acted alone, that she didn't know a thing. At first I refused. I told her we both had to own it. His voice turned to a hushed rasp. But then she threatened me. Said she'd pin it all on me anyway if I didn't cooperate. And she had the proof to back it up, the documents, the messages, everything in order to make it believable. A shiver crawled up David's spine. The Marie he remembered was warm, honest, genuine. Could she have really set this up so precisely, so coldly? His mind drifted back to the article he'd read. No sign of deceit in any of her records. All of that airtight evidence. Had she been planning to discard him from the very beginning? Trevor's voice cut through the silence, rough with emotion. I loved her. Even after everything, I still did. I didn't want her locked away. Truth is, I didn't want that for myself either. So I ran. He let out a brittle chuckle. We had a plan. I had a boat stashed away, some cash hidden. The idea was simple. I'd disappear, and once things cooled off, she'd follow. David's brows pulled together. You really thought she'd run with you? Trevor's jaw tightened. That was the plan. But after I left, she never showed. I waited offshore the entire next day. Then a friend contacted me, told me the cops had questioned her. She sold it perfectly. They believed her without a doubt. A dry, mirthless laugh escaped him. She looked out for herself, let me fade into nothing. David grasped for any thread of hope. Maybe she intended to go, but something got in the way. Trevor gave a vague shrug. Maybe. I waited as long as I could. But once they started hunting me, staying put became suicide. She had a clean out. She'd have been a fool to follow. So I vanished. I ended up here eventually, took a new name, started again from zero, kept a low profile, stayed out of sight. He turned away slightly. I never tried to contact her. She didn't either. The garage settled into silence, the only sound the faint drip of rainwater tapping from the roof above. David stood motionless, his thoughts spiraling, unable to find solid ground. If Trevor was telling the truth, and every word carried the weight of something hard-earned and bitter, then Marie hadn't just stood silently by. She had helped design the con and made sure she escaped untouched. She let Trevor take the blame, alone. "Why didn't you ever speak up?" David asked, his voice hushed. "If she betrayed you like that, why not expose her?" Trevor let out a slow, tired breath. "Confess? Go to prison? Drag her down with me?" He gave a small, weary shake of his head. "I thought about it, especially when the betrayal was still fresh. But I was already neck-deep in it. I had a new life, a fresh alias. Prison didn't exactly sound like redemption, and even if I'd tried, what proof did I have? She was meticulous, left no trace." He paused, then went on, softer now. "Eventually, I just wanted to disappear. I assumed she already had. Different name, different world. Yeah, it hurt. But..." He looked off, eyes lost to the past. "I wasn't innocent either. I played my part, and I did love her, in my own broken way. As mad as I was, a part of me felt relief she never got caught." Then Trevor turned, eyes narrowing as he studied David with sudden sharpness. "You came all this way, so tell me, what is it you really want?" David's mouth felt dry, the question hanging too heavily in the air. Why had he come? To find the truth, that much he knew. But now that it was laid bare before him, what was he supposed to do with it? His thoughts drifted to Marie, likely at home right now, completely unaware her secrets had been stripped open. He thought of their life together, something that now felt like a fragile illusion. Anger stirred inside him. I'm not sure," he admitted, each word a struggle. "I just couldn't keep living in the dark. I had to know if she was a victim of it all or the one who pulled the strings," Trevor finished grimly. "Well, now you know." David looked down, eyes settling on the stained concrete floor between them. "Thanks," he murmured. "I know this couldn't have been easy." Trevor rose from the crate where he'd been sitting, moving with the stiffness of someone carrying old weight. "No, it wasn't," he said. "I thought I'd buried this for good, but saying it aloud, there's a strange kind of peace in that. Just be careful, David. If she's been lying this long, there's no telling what else she's hiding." The warning sank deep, cold and unsettling. David thought back to all the times she'd avoided questions, all the quick subject changes when anything about the past came up. He'd believed it was pain. Maybe it had been fear that the truth would finally catch up. He extended his hand. Trevor hesitated for a moment, then took it. Between them hung a quiet sorrow, two men connected by the betrayal of the same woman. "Take care, David," Trevor said gently. "And, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to spill over the way it has." "You too," David replied. He paused. "Trevor?" But Trevor didn't answer. David turned and stepped under the half-lifted garage door, out into the gray, cloud-heavy afternoon. He could feel Trevor's gaze following him as he walked toward the car. And then he was gone. As David drove away from the familiar calm of Greenport, the autumn breeze kicked up bursts of leaves along the pavement. His thoughts churned violently, anger at Marie's betrayal, sorrow for the life he thought he knew, and dread about what the future might hold. Amid the storm of emotion, one thing had become unmistakably clear. He could no longer live a lie. Marie hadn't just deceived those she and Trevor had conned, she'd betrayed him too. She needed to be held accountable. He hadn't decided how the confrontation would happen, but he was certain it had to, and soon. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. Darkness had settled by the time David pulled into his driveway. The house, once a shared sanctuary between him and Marie, sat quietly beneath the mellow hue of the porch light. He parked the car and lingered, fingers gripping the wheel as he struggled to steady his breath. His recent trip to Pennsylvania had brought him the answers he'd sought, but they pressed down on him like a weight too heavy to bear. The most painful moments were still ahead. Inside, Marie lay sprawled on the couch, a book open on her lap. Her eyes, unfocused, stared blankly at a page she hadn't turned in ages. The sound of the door unlocking jolted her back to the present. "David, you're home!" she said, rushing to her feet, relief spilling from her voice. She reached for him instinctively, but he stepped away. Her arms fell, unreturned, between them. "How was your trip?" she asked, uncertainty creeping in as she noticed his rigid stance and steely expression. He shut the door slowly, his whole body taut with emotion. "Long," he replied, the word clipped and hard. Marie tucked her hair behind her ear, visibly unsettled. "You seem off. Is everything okay?" He let out a slow, pointed breath through his nose. "Okay isn't the word I'd use." She froze. "We need to talk," David said, his voice low but unwavering. The color drained from her face. "Of course," she said softly, gesturing toward the living room. "Do you want to sit? I can make tea." "No," he said firmly, his voice unshakable. "We'll do this here." He stood just inside the doorway, unmoving. She lingered nearby, twisting her fingers nervously. An uneasy silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. He locked eyes with her, trying, perhaps in vain, to glimpse the woman he once believed he knew. She parted her lips to speak, but he cut her off, his tone quiet but razor-edged. "Why didn't you ever tell me you were married before?" The words landed like thunder. Her eyes widened, lips parting in shock. "What are you saying?" "Don't," David shot back, his voice raw. "Don't pretend ignorance now." He pulled out a folded stack of photocopied papers from his bag, records he'd found at the library, and let them fall onto the entry table. Some fluttered to the floor. The top page showed a grainy newspaper photo, Marie and Trevor on a yacht, smiling. Marie's hand flew to her face as the image registered. Her skin turned pale, and she stumbled backward, as if the picture had struck her. "David, I can explain," she whispered, barely audible. She wasn't denying it. That alone was enough to fracture him. "So it's true," he said, his throat tight. "You were married to Trevor Sanders." She shut her eyes against the weight of it and nodded faintly, tears already threatening. "Yes, I was." Her confirmation felt like a knife. A tear traced his cheek, but he wiped it away quickly. His voice cracked as he spoke. 2 years of marriage, 3 years before that, and you never thought I deserved the truth?" Marie took a hesitant step forward, hands reaching out in pleading. "I wanted to tell you, I really did. But I was afraid. I was ashamed. That part of my life." He flinched from her touch. "Afraid? Ashamed?" he echoed, disbelief sharpening each word. "That's your justification?" His voice broke as he looked at her, this stranger he once loved. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I don't even know who you are anymore." She flinched at his words, her face wet with quiet, unchecked tears. "I'm still me," she said softly. "The woman you fell for, the one who's always been yours. That part of my past, it was a nightmare. I never meant for it to reach us." David dragged both hands down his face, gripping hard, like he could anchor himself in place. The emotions clawing at him were powerful, but he couldn't let them take over. He needed clarity, honest, whole, and without distortion. He dropped his hands and locked eyes with her. "Then give me the whole story. No more dancing around it, no more bits and pieces." His voice cut through the silence. "Why the secrecy, Marie? What really happened with Trevor?" Her frame shuddered as she crossed her arms tightly over her chest. Her eyes flicked to the scattered pages and clippings on the table, unavoidable remnants of a truth long buried. Cornered at last, she gave a slight resigned nod. "All right," she breathed. "But can we sit down?" David paused before giving a single short nod. They moved to the living room. He took the chair opposite her, intentionally keeping distance, while she slowly lowered herself onto the couch. A shaky breath passed her lips. "I should have told you sooner. I get that now. I should have come clean, before the engagement, maybe even before we got serious. But I was terrified you'd leave." "Start with Trevor," David said, voice flat and guarded. "Who was he to you, and why did he vanish?" She wiped at her wet cheeks, steeling herself. Like you already know, I was married to him. We met soon after college. By 24, we were married. In the beginning, it felt right. He had charisma, ambition. I believed I loved him. Her words hit a snag. But then his business. She gestured vaguely toward the array of documents. You've probably read all the headlines. I want to hear it from your mouth, David replied, firm. Marie lowered her gaze and nodded. Trevor started an investment firm. I helped, just informally. I kept his books. David's jaw clenched. He'd guessed this much, but hearing it directly cut deeper. Bookkeeping, he repeated flat. And did you know what he was doing, what it really was? She looked wrecked. Not right away. But eventually, yes. She glanced up briefly, guilt carved into her expression. By the time I understood how bad things were, we were in too deep. He kept insisting he had a solution, that he'd quietly repay people and undo the damage. But now I think, maybe he was just lying to himself. David thought back to what Trevor had claimed, that Marie had been the one urging the fraud onward. He said he had a plan, David repeated, his voice tight with doubt. And when everything started to collapse, what was your response then? Her hands twisted in her lap, fingers curling into fists. When it all started unraveling, I was petrified. People were losing everything. Some of them had started to catch on. One guy was close to going to the police or filing a lawsuit. Trevor was falling apart. She spoke barely above a whisper. I told him we should run. David's eyes narrowed, brows raising. That clashed with Trevor's version. He'd claimed Marie panicked after him. So, you were the one who suggested running? She nodded faintly, shame heavy in the motion. I thought it was the only way. We had some cash tucked away. I figured if we vanished, maybe we could start fresh. Maybe even fix things down the line. It sounds foolish now, but I was desperate. David's tone was quiet, but his words were unwavering. And after that? David's voice sliced through the tension in the room, icy and precise. So Trevor vanishes, and somehow you're still here. How does that add up? Marie's throat constricted as she swallowed hard. We were supposed to leave that night, she said slowly. But we argued. What was the fight about? He had another plan, one last trick to make more money. Did it involve bringing in someone new? I said no, Marie replied, her tone strained. I was done. I wanted out before it got worse. They had screamed at each other, raw, brutal words hurled back and forth. He said if I wouldn't back him, I could rot in hell. And then he walked out. She stopped, gaze unfocused, lost in the memory. I figured he'd cool off and come back. But the next morning, he was gone. Took the boat. Left me behind. David narrowed his eyes, suspicious. So he just abandoned you? That's your version? Marie's eyes shimmered, but she held her ground, her pain barely veiled by defiance. That's exactly what happened. He left. I was by myself when the cops showed up. Had to face it all on my own. I was terrified, David. I cooperated with everything. Told them what I could. I had to prove I wasn't part of it. Weren't you? He asked, voice like a blade. Not part of it? Marie parted her lips to respond, but nothing came out. Her silence filled the space, loud, damning. David raked a hand through his hair, the weight of it all pressing down on him. Jesus, Marie! How many people's lives did you wreck? How much money are we even talking? She dropped her head, shame heavy on her shoulders. I don't know. At least a few 100,000. I wasn't the one keeping track of that. David's stare was a storm of hurt and fury. The woman sitting in front of him, he barely recognized her. And still it was her face, tear-streaked and broken, that he loved, which only made the wound deeper. I deserve the truth, he said finally. Were you ever going to tell me? Or were you just hoping it would stay buried? Marie's lips trembled. I wanted to, so many times, especially after we got serious, after the proposal. But I was scared you'd see me like you do now. Her voice broke apart. Like I'm something awful. David shut his eyes, emotions surging, a burn behind his lashes. I'm trying, Marie, trying to understand how you lived with this, how you laid beside me each night carrying all that. Then she rose and crossed the room, dropping to her knees in front of him. He froze, uncertain, as her trembling hands took his. You made me believe I could change, she said, desperate. And I did. I've spent every single day since trying to fix what I broke. That's why I work at the nonprofit. Why I agonize over every penny, every choice. I've been making amends, quietly, without telling anyone. I never wanted to cause pain again. David looked down at her, at the vulnerability laid bare on her face. It seemed genuine. It felt honest. And still, the lie, the years of it, yawned like a chasm between them. Making things right in silence, he said softly. Never confessing. How convenient. His voice was gentler now, but still firm, still steady. You're supposed to move forward, to live your life as if everything is normal, while Trevor and those he misled remain trapped in the aftermath. But what about them? They never heard the truth. They were never given closure. Marie leaned against his leg, tears silently streaming down her cheeks. I know, she murmured. Not a single day goes by that I don't relive it in my head. I was scared, David. I should have stayed and faced the consequences, but I panicked. Her breath caught as she spoke. Trevor fled. And when I realized he had no intention of coming back for me, I was overwhelmed, angry, betrayed. But also, I felt a strange kind of freedom. Freedom that maybe I could begin again. She lifted her tear-stained face, her eyes wide with desperation. But I'm not that same frightened girl anymore. I love you more deeply than I can say. You've helped me grow into someone I never believed I could be. Please don't turn away from me. David's hands shook as they rested in hers. He had never seen her like this, so vulnerable, so broken. Part of him wanted nothing more than to hold her and shield her from the pain. But another part, the part still haunted by Trevor's cryptic warnings, hesitated. Was this true remorse? Or just another way to avoid facing the consequences? He slowly pulled his hands free and rose to his feet. Marie remained where she was, still kneeling, her tears falling like wordless pleas. I can't do this right now, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I need time to think. She gazed up at him, her face etched with sorrow. David, please don't go. I'll do whatever it takes. Just stay. Her words tore at him, but he still stepped away. I'm going for a drive, he said gently. Don't follow me. I need to be alone for a while. Before she could speak again, he turned and walked out, leaving her collapsed on the floor, crying his name into the quiet. David slid into the driver's seat and drove without a destination, tears clouding his eyes so heavily he had to pull over on a deserted side street just a few blocks away. He turned off the car and sat there in the dark, the only illumination coming from a distant street lamp down the road. His entire body trembled as waves of emotion overtook him. He slammed his fists against the steering wheel, letting out a cry filled with pain and confusion. This wasn't the life he had pictured. The woman he had trusted and loved, now entangled in something so fundamentally wrong. He remembered their laughter, their quiet nights together, the promises exchanged in whispers. Now all of it seemed distorted, like looking through shattered glass at a memory. Eventually the tears ran dry, leaving him empty and cold inside. Marie's sobs, her pleading words echoed in his ears. One sentence kept repeating in his mind. She claimed she had changed. And maybe she had. The Marie he knew was kind, selfless, seemingly honest. Could someone truly transform so deeply? Or had it all been part of the deception? He thought of the hours she gave to the charity, the weekends spent volunteering at the shelter. Maybe those acts were her way of seeking redemption, a way to tip the scales back toward good. But did any of that truly erase what she had done? Could a lifetime of kindness undo the choice to run from what was right? In his heart, David knew the answer. The truth still mattered. So did accountability. And if those values meant anything to him, how could he continue to share a life with someone who had abandoned them both? Despite everything, the thought of turning his wife in to the authorities made David's stomach churn. He still loved her. Even now, after all the lies and damage, his heart was at war with the betrayal that poisoned it. She was begging for mercy, swearing she had changed, pleading for another chance. David leaned forward, pressing his forehead to the steering wheel, overcome. His emotions and moral compass were locked in an unending battle. One truth stood unshakable. Whatever decision he made, nothing would ever return to the way it once was. And the clock was ticking. Chapter 6. Crossroads. When dawn finally crept across the sky, David was still sitting motionless in his parked car. He hadn't gotten far the previous night, just meandering through back roads in the dark, his thoughts as aimless as his driving, until exhaustion pinned him down. He managed only a couple hours of uneasy sleep before the cold morning stirred him. With a sigh that seemed to come from deep within, he restarted the engine and turned toward home, a grim understanding setting in. As he pulled into the driveway just after 6, the soft glow of the living room lights caught his eye. Marie hadn't gone to bed. He braced himself. Inside, she was curled up on the couch beneath a blanket, her face streaked and swollen from tears. She bolted upright when she heard him enter, her expression flickering between fragile hope and raw fear. "You came back," she whispered, voice broken and dry. He nodded silently, easing the door shut behind him. It felt like he was floating outside his own body, watching a stranger go through the motions. "We need to talk," he said, "and I need you to really hear me this time." Marie slowly rose, clinging to the blanket like armor against whatever was coming. In that moment, she seemed so fragile, so diminished, that he nearly faltered. But then he remembered everyone her choices had hurt, the wreckage she'd left behind. "I've spent all night thinking," he said, measuring each word, "thinking about what you did, and about what I have to do." Her eyes welled with fresh tears. She took a tentative step forward. "David, He raised a hand gently, stopping her mid-sentence. "Let me finish." He drew a breath and forced himself to keep going. "If I stay quiet, if I let this stay buried, maybe we could pretend it never happened. Maybe no one else would ever know. But I would. Every day I'd wake up knowing I helped hide what you did, and I can't live with that." A choked cry escaped her lips. "What are you saying?" His voice wavered, but he pushed on. "I'm going to tell someone. I have to report it." "The police!" she gasped, her face draining of color. The blanket slipped from her shoulders and landed in a heap. She stood frozen, stunned. No, David, you can't. Please don't." His own eyes stung now, the weight of it crashing over him. "I have to," he said, barely more than a breath. "It's the only right thing left to do." Suddenly, she closed the distance between them, gripping his arms in desperation. "There's another way," she said, frantic. "We can make this right. We can return the money. I didn't spend all of it. I still have some hidden away." That admission sliced through his grief like a fresh wound. She had held on to the money, kept it secret. It felt like yet another betrayal. But he stayed focused. Carefully, he peeled her fingers off his arms. "It doesn't matter anymore," he said softly. "Even if you returned every cent, the damage is already done." She broke down completely, her sobs spilling out in torrents. "If you go to the police, I'll go to prison. Is that what you want? To destroy everything we built together? To throw away our life?" The word life struck him like a blow. They had talked about starting a family, growing old side by side. But that future, the one they once imagined, was already gone. Now, it was nothing but broken pieces of a dream they could no longer claim. His eyes clamped shut as tears poured down his cheeks. "You shattered everything, Marie. The moment you decided to lie, day after day throughout our marriage, you buried something lethal underneath us. It wasn't me who set it off. It was already counting down." Marie collapsed, folding to the floor, her knees hitting the ground. Her hands clasped tightly like a desperate plea in motion. "Please, I'm begging you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "We can walk away from all of this. Start again, just us. If this really matters to you, we'll vanish. Just like Trevor did." David's eyes flew open, a wave of disgust crossing his features. In that moment, he didn't see his wife. He saw the echo of someone who had already made her choice long ago. Someone who preferred escape to accountability. He took a step away from her. "I'm not going to run," he said, steady and cold. "And deep down, I don't believe you want to either. Not anymore. You've been fleeing long enough." Her body trembled as harsh sobs broke from her chest, her arms wrapping around herself for balance. "I'm so scared," she choked, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to end up in prison." Tears spilled freely from David now. He moved closer, kneeling but keeping a cautious distance. He didn't reach out. He couldn't. But he made sure she could see every inch of his sorrow. "Do you think this is easy for me?" he asked, his voice cracking under the strain. "I'm terrified too. This is tearing me apart. I never thought it would come to this. but I can't pretend anymore. If you really want to make this right, if you honestly want to be the person you've tried to become, you need to face what you've done." Her eyes slowly lifted to his, pain etched into every line of her face. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by their quiet sobbing. Eventually, Marie swiped at her nose, her expression shifting. It wasn't hope that emerged, just a quiet acceptance. "If I turn myself in," she said gently, "will you be there? Will you stay?" David felt his heart split open. More than anything, he wanted to say yes, to wrap her in reassurance. But inside, he didn't know. He couldn't tell if their love could weather what was coming. "I don't know," he said softly. I can't give you that promise. It hurts too much right now." She gave a slow nod, as if she'd expected that answer all along. Fresh tears rose in her eyes, but she stayed silent. David stood, his legs unsure beneath him. "I'm going to call them," he said quietly. Marie stayed where she was, arms hugging her own body. Her eyes stared blankly at the wall, unmoving. She didn't answer, but her silence carried more weight than words. David walked to the kitchen and picked up the phone. His fingers moved like they belonged to someone else as he dialed. When the non-emergency line picked up, he cleared his throat, trying to sound steady. "I'd like to report a crime," he said. The words landed like a punch to his gut. He gave them what they needed. A case of old financial deception, a missing person recently found, and a partner who had knowingly helped keep it all buried. As he spoke, it felt like he was recounting someone else's life. Distant, unreal. He gave them Marie's full name, including her maiden name, and everything he knew about Trevor. His fake identity, and the place in Pennsylvania where he was likely hiding. The detective absorbed everything and calmly asked David to come to the station to make an official report. When David ended the call, a tremor overtook his hands. It was done. There was no undoing it now. He made his way back to the living room. Marie was still on the floor, dazed, her eyes dry but distant. She looked up at him, her face blank and unreadable. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David found it difficult to look at her directly. "They want me to come in, give them a formal statement," he said in a low voice. You might want to find a lawyer." A short, joyless laugh escaped her, brittle and worn with fatigue. "A lawyer, of course." Slowly, shakily, she pushed herself upright. David instinctively stepped forward, but she halted him with a raised hand. The space between them felt colder than ever. "I'll start looking," she murmured. "I guess I have until they arrive to pick me up." The implication struck David like a physical blow. He winced inside, though his face stayed still. "They won't waste time," he replied, "especially now that they know where Trevor is." Marie gave a faint nod, her eyes wandering across the room where so much of their life had unfolded. Her gaze settled on a photo resting on a shelf, the two of them radiant on their wedding day, untouched by what was to come. She let out a shaky breath. "I'm sorry," she whispered. David wasn't sure who those words were for, him, their past, or herself. His throat tightened. Any attempt to speak would shatter him. He reached for his coat. "I need to go to the station." "Will I be okay?" she said, with a humorless chuckle. "Number. But I guess that doesn't matter, does it?" Her tone softened. "I'll still be here when you get back." He stopped briefly, tempted to reach for her, to hold her just once more, but forced himself to stay still. He said nothing, just turned and left. At the precinct, David spent hours recounting everything to two detectives. Eventually, a federal agent stepped in once the case escalated to a higher level. He handed over the documents he'd printed, walked them through how he tracked Trevor down, and detailed every step of the process. The questioning stretched well into the evening. When it finally concluded, they thanked him and assured him things would proceed quickly. As he exited the building, dusk was descending over the city skyline. The FBI agent reiterated their appreciation, assuring him that further steps would follow soon. They didn't say when, but David understood. Their home could be visited at any moment. When he pulled into the driveway, fatigue bore down on him like a weight. Inside, Marie sat silently in the dim light cast by a lone lamp beside the couch. She met his eyes briefly, then looked away. There were no words, None were needed. That night, they occupied different rooms. David took the guest room. Marie stayed in theirs. Neither of them slept. David lay motionless, staring into the darkness. Now and then he heard muffled sobs leaking through the bedroom door. Just after sunrise, the sound of car doors slamming jolted him awake. He leapt from the bed as a sharp knock rang out from the front door. There were voices too, calm, professional, unmistakably official. By the time David reached the living room, Marie had already opened it. 3 officers stood at the entrance, 2 in full uniform, and the plainclothes detective who had been there the previous day. Marie, still dressed in her pajamas and robe, turned briefly to look at David. Her expression was stricken with hopelessness as the men stepped inside. "Mrs. Carter," the detective said, his tone measured, "you're under arrest. We have a warrant." He moved toward her with deliberate caution, as if approaching something fragile and afraid. One of the uniformed officers produced a pair of handcuffs. A strangled gasp escaped Marie's throat. She turned quickly to David, her voice quivering. "David?" He couldn't respond. His body felt paralyzed, seized by anguish and disbelief. "I'm here," he managed, the words barely audible, cracking beneath the pressure of his emotions. He wanted to go to her, to reach out and hold her, but the officers were already in the space between them. As they recited her rights and gently drew her arms behind her, locking the cuffs around her wrists, tears streamed silently down her face. She didn't fight. Her limbs went slack, overcome with shock and sorrow. As they began to escort her away, she twisted back suddenly, pleading. "Please, just a second," she cried, casting one final look toward David. Her gaze was desperate, haunted. "Don't forget me," she whispered. David had to draw on every last bit of willpower to stay upright. He gave a slight nod, too choked with emotion to speak. Then she was gone, guided through the doorway toward a waiting patrol car. He remained rooted in place, watching as she was gently helped into the back seat. Their eyes found each other one last time through the glass. He raised a shaking hand to his mouth to muffle a sob as the car pulled away. Even after the vehicles disappeared down the street, he stood motionless at the threshold, bathed in the growing light of morning. It was over. Whatever life they had built together had been irrevocably broken, torn apart by the truth David had uncovered and chosen to confront. Now all that remained was the silence left in its wake. Chapter 7. The Fallout. Word of Marie's arrest spread swiftly. Within hours, it swept through the neighborhood, then caught fire in the local news, driven by the shocking nature of the case. Reporters unearthed an old scandal from nearly 10 years ago, publishing sensational headlines like, "Renowned architect's wife implicated in cold case deception." Almost overnight, David was thrust into an unwanted spotlight. In the days that followed, he receded from public view. He requested a temporary leave from work. His supervisor, seeing the media van stationed outside the office, agreed it was for the best. A few colleagues reached out, offering quiet words of support. Others kept their distance, unsure of what to say or do. David stumbled across cruel online commentary, anonymous voices hurling accusations, suggesting he had betrayed Marie, asking why he would turn in his own wife. The remarks struck deeper than he anticipated, even though he knew those people had no understanding of the real story. But the sharpest blow came from Marie's family. Her younger sister called him once, weeping and shouting, accusing him of heartless betrayal, of ruining Marie's life. Her parents, who lived out of state, sent a terse message cutting all ties with him. To them, he no longer existed. David understood their pain. They were grieving, desperate for someone to blame, and he was the most convenient target. Still, their rejection left a wound he couldn't ignore. The only person who might have truly grasped the complexity of his decision was his mother, long gone. His father, quiet but steadfast, offered his support in few words. "You did what was right," he said plainly. He also promised to help with legal costs if needed. The days stretched endlessly, slowly folding into weeks. David moved through those days in a fog of hopelessness and anxiety. Not once did he miss one of Marie's pretrial hearings. Each time, he slipped into a quiet spot at the back of the courtroom, unacknowledged, unnoticed, but incapable of staying away. At the bail hearing, he saw her brought in, wearing the harsh orange of a prison uniform. She looked diminished, fear radiating from her like heat. When the judge refused to grant bail, pointing to the gravity of the charges and Marie's background as potential flight risks, the weight of it settled on David like a burial cloth. She would remain locked up until her trial began. The thought of Marie lying awake behind bars while he returned to a lifeless, empty house gnawed at him constantly. He wandered through rooms that used to pulse with warmth, now hollow and cold, haunted by echoes. The impression in the couch cushion where she'd read her novels, the stool she always chose during their caffeine-fueled conversations, everything remained untouched, like quiet monuments to a life now out of reach. Late at night, in the hush of darkness, he often caught himself staring at her name on his phone screen, thumb hovering over the call button. He never pressed it. He wasn't even sure she'd be allowed to answer. And if she could, what would he say? That he was sorry? That he missed her more than he could bear? He meant all of that, deeply, painfully, but it felt too small, too late. Weeks passed before he received a call he hadn't anticipated. Emma. She'd heard the news from others and through the media. Her voice carried sadness but not reproach. In fact, she offered something David hadn't realized he needed: respect. "I don't know if I would have had the strength to do what you did," she said gently. That simple recognition gave David a fleeting moment of peace in the storm of isolation he lived in. Emma even offered to testify on Marie's emotional state in the days after Trevor disappeared. But in the end, the prosecutors didn't call her. As for Trevor, justice found him too. He was arrested in Pennsylvania the same day Marie was taken in, something David learned only from the FBI, not from Trevor himself. Part of David had held on to the hope that Trevor would reach out, explain, maybe even apologize. But no call came. Instead, Trevor quickly agreed to cooperate, accepting a plea deal that reduced his charges and earned him a lighter sentence. He handed over a wealth of evidence, emails, documents, financial records, all of it pointing straight at Marie. Reading his name in legal filings under his old identity felt surreal to David, as though Trevor Stevens had never truly existed. When the trial finally began, months later, it unfolded like a slow, relentless tragedy. Marie entered a not guilty plea at first, resolute in the early stages. But as the prosecution laid out its case, Trevor's damning testimony, forensic digital evidence, archived messages, her defense began to crumble. Halfway through, she changed her plea to guilty on multiple fraud and conspiracy counts. David was there that day, hidden in a darkened corner of the gallery, doing his best to disappear into the shadows. As Marie stood to change her plea, she scanned the courtroom, just for a second. Their eyes met. For the briefest moment, they saw each other. He stayed frozen in place, torn between the urge to reach for her or to vanish. His heart pounded. He thought he saw the glint of tears, her lips parting ever so slightly. And then she was gone again, led back into custody. He didn't know if seeing him brought her comfort or only compounded her suffering. Eventually, sentencing came. The judge ordered Marie to serve 5 years in state prison, with a chance of parole after 3. Many felt it was a light punishment, given the scope of the crimes. But the judge considered her clean record since the events, and the fact that she had no prior convictions. Trevor, in contrast, received 7 years. His cooperation had spared him a harsher fate, but it hadn't bought his freedom. The truth was undeniable. What transpired would haunt them both indefinitely, untouched by the passage of time or the confines of prison walls. On the last day of the trial, David exited the courthouse carrying the heavy burden of an irreversible sorrow. There was no relief in the verdict, only the grim recognition that something essential had been permanently broken. As he stepped down onto the concrete outside, a cluster of reporters pressed in. "Mr. Carter, do you have a comment for us? Do you believe justice has been served?" Camera flashes sliced through the overcast light like sharp white sparks. David didn't stop. He said nothing. What was there to say? That he'd clung to his principles and watched his world disintegrate? There wasn't a soundbite that could capture that truth. Later that evening, wrapped in the silence of his house, David sat alone with his thoughts. He searched for the strength to keep moving forward, and buried deep within him, held on to a faint hope that Marie might someday find forgiveness, or even redemption. He was certain he had done the right thing. Despite the cold judgment of others and the aching silence that now filled his days, he knew he couldn't have acted any differently. Still, doing what was right had come at a devastating cost. His marriage had crumbled, trust had been lost, and his once vibrant social circle had vanished, many choosing silence and distance after the truth came out. All he had left was his conscience and the long, unfamiliar road of healing. Chapter 8. After the Fall. In the days following the trial, David drifted through his routines like an actor reciting someone else's lines. He signed the divorce papers Marie had sent from prison through her attorney. Irreconcilable differences. No debate, no bitter court battle. It ended swiftly and impersonally. 3 years of shared life reduced to legal forms and a name on a dotted line. Dropping the envelope into the mailbox left him hollow, but oddly, it also brought a sense of closure he hadn't anticipated. That part of his life was officially over. He sold the house. Its walls echoed with too many memories, some sweet, others suffocating. Remaining in that town only invited stares, murmured gossip, and forced condolences. Sorting through their belongings was like dismantling a life still half-built. Photographs, souvenirs of their time together, he didn't know what to do with them. Keep them? Destroy them? Pretend they'd never meant anything? In the end, he held on to a few, a quiet acknowledgement that not all of it had been a lie. The rest he either tossed out or left behind. He needed a clean slate. When a Boston firm offered him a position, he accepted. The city held distant acquaintances from college and, more importantly, no one who recognized his name from the scandal. To his new colleagues, he wasn't part of any sordid past, just a skilled architect with an impressive resume. The firm valued his experience, and since he'd never been implicated in wrongdoing, brought him on without hesitation. Some even respected him for staying true to his ethics, though to David such praise felt empty, his personal losses too deep to see any of this as a win. Relocating brought both relief and loneliness. No more wary glances from neighbors, but also no familiar faces to lean on. At 36, he was beginning again from scratch. He rented a modest apartment near the Charles River. It didn't resemble the home he'd once shared with Marie, but its simplicity offered a certain comfort. The nights were the worst. Dreams of her would come unbidden, or worse, nightmares of faceless voices accusing him, pursuing him through the dark. Yet with time, the apartment felt less like a strange new space. Gradually, it became something like a sanctuary, a place where rebuilding didn't feel impossible. Work was his constant. Soon after arriving, the firm handed him a key project, designing a new wing for a contemporary art museum. He threw himself into his work, losing track of time as he drafted blueprints and crafted intricate digital models. His thoughts became consumed by angles, calculations, and structural challenges, leaving little space for the memories he was trying to forget. His colleagues quickly sensed his preference for solitude and respected the boundary he silently established. Whispers circulated, hints of a troubled past that most only vaguely understood. Some recalled the scandal that had tarnished his name, but no one confronted him about it. Occasionally, someone would make a quiet comment, expressing admiration for how he'd handled everything. He'd respond with a polite nod and gently redirect the conversation back to deadlines or the specifics of a build. In those early days, David kept things strictly professional, never allowing anyone too close. Outside the office, he lived with purposeful simplicity. His life became a series of calming habits, pre-dawn runs along the river, slow, aimless hours spent wandering the local bookstore, and infrequent but steady calls with his father or with Emma, who still checked in from time to time. He also began seeing a therapist, Dr. Emmons, a calm and compassionate man with a soft voice and an empathetic demeanor. Their sessions became a space where David could begin to untangle the emotional knots he hadn't dared to face. With time, he started to understand a painful but freeing truth. Though he still mourned, Marie's decisions weren't his to atone for. His duty ended with what he chose to do next. It was a hard truth to absorb, one he had to remind himself of over and over again. Gradually, his career began to gain momentum. His design for the museum's new extension drew attention and earned him a glowing feature in an architectural journal. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to feel a quiet sense of pride, muted but genuine. It was strange to receive praise while still feeling emotionally unsteady, like standing on a shifting foundation. His manager began hinting at bigger roles on the horizon, a potential promotion, or maybe even a path toward partnership. Clients valued his calm presence and careful eye for detail. Slowly, he started building a new reputation, one grounded in his talent rather than past associations. Still, when it came to personal relationships, he kept his walls up. In social settings, he remained friendly but reserved. If anyone pryed into his personal life, he offered short, vague replies. When asked if he was married, he'd just say, "Not anymore," and move on. He occasionally attended professional mixers or joined co-workers for a drink, but often left early, especially if the conversation turned too personal. Letting others in still felt dangerous. The wounds hadn't fully healed. And yet, almost without realizing it, David was beginning to move forward. The nightmares that once haunted his sleep began to fade. Whole days, and eventually, whole weeks, passed without thoughts of Marie or the chaos she left behind. Buried in work, surrounded by sketches and specs, his mind would finally go quiet. He began to notice little things that brought him happiness again. Unexpected laughter during a casual ball game with colleagues, or the peaceful satisfaction of helping a neighbor fix a broken step on their porch. Then, one crisp autumn morning nearly a year after his move to Boston, something shifted. As he jogged along the river under a pastel sunrise, he realized something quietly profound. He hadn't cried in months. He slowed his pace, almost stopping, surprised by the calm that settled over him. He didn't feel euphoric, nor did he feel weighed down. He just felt okay. And that simple, steady feeling nearly brought him to a halt. In that stillness, David recognized something important. The storm had passed. He had survived, scarred but intact. And in the soft golden light of that morning, he allowed himself to believe, however cautiously, that life might hold something good for him again. Not immediately, not like before, but someday in ways he couldn't yet see. Chapter 9. A New Chapter. And just as that quiet moment had suggested, change did come. For David, not in sweeping transformations or dramatic turns, but in small, meaningful steps that unfolded steadily over the next year. One of those turning points arrived at the grand opening gala for the museum's new wing, the very space he had envisioned and brought to life. The project that had once anchored David through the bleakest chapter of his life was now complete, and the entire city had turned out to honor it. That evening, he stepped into the grand gala carrying a complex mix of gratitude and apprehension. Though he never sought the spotlight, the museum insisted on publicly recognizing him as the mastermind behind the design. Dressed in an impeccable suit, David spent the early part of the night exchanging pleasantries, shaking hands, and receiving compliments from patrons and benefactors. He took genuine pride in what they had built, a graceful, contemporary addition to the museum that managed to be both state-of-the-art and warmly inviting. Its curves of glass and hints of steel folded effortlessly into the historic elegance of the original structure. Feeling the evening's weight settle on him, David began to drift toward a quieter corner of the gallery, making his way to a favorite sculpture, a towering modern form that always quieted his thoughts. The crowd had begun to thin there, granting him a brief pocket of peace. Then a voice, soft and lyrical, reached him from behind. "Beautiful, isn't it?" He turned to see a woman near his own age, perhaps a few years younger, studying the sculpture. Her smile radiated warmth and her observant eyes missed nothing. Something about her struck a chord. He realized he'd seen her earlier, briefly introduced during the opening remarks as one of the assistant curators. "It is," David agreed, then added with a modest tilt of his head, "though I can't take credit for the art itself, only the space around it." Recognition flickered in her expression. "Of course, you're David Carter. We've exchanged a few emails about the exhibit layout. I'm Claire Everett. I guess this is our long-overdue introduction." "Claire, yes," he said, the name triggering his memory. They shook hands, and unexpectedly, David felt a twinge of something unfamiliar, an almost forgotten kind of nervous energy. "It's good to finally meet you face to face," he said, "and honestly, you deserve some of the credit. Placing this piece under the skylight like that, it was a perfect call." She gave a modest laugh, tinged with a hint of pink in her cheeks. "Thanks. Though I think the skylight made the decision for me." They both laughed softly, easy, unguarded. What began as a brief, courteous interaction gradually unfolded into something more. Claire had a natural ease, an intellect and enthusiasm for art that matched her openness. She asked thoughtful questions about his creative process, listened attentively, and offered keen observations on the challenges of integrating new design with established collections. For the first time in ages, David found himself enjoying a conversation that didn't revolve around deadlines or logistics. He even laughed, deeply, unexpectedly, when Claire recounted a story about a mislabeled sculpture that nearly wound up installed upside down. Eventually, they walked together through the new gallery wing, pointing out details in the architecture and the exhibits, exchanging ideas as equals. When they reached a balcony overlooking the museum's soaring central lobby, Claire's tone shifted. "You know," she said gently, "you should feel proud, not just of what you built here, but of what you had to overcome to do it." The words took him by surprise. "What makes you say that?" he asked, though a part of him already knew. Her smile was soft, tentative. "I hope I'm not overstepping," she said, "but I read about your wife." There was no discomfort in her gaze, only kindness and an understanding that felt rare. "I can't pretend to know what that was like. But for you to carry that grief and still create something so vibrant, so full of soul, that's remarkable." At the mention of Marie, David felt the now familiar ache tighten in his chest. Yet Claire's voice held no awkward sympathy, no patronizing tone. He lowered his gaze to the polished stone floor. "It was," he said, his voice low, "the hardest thing I've ever been through." She touched his arm lightly, just a brief contact, but filled with genuine care. "I'm sorry," she said, "truly, and I admire what you've done. This place, it means something, and that's because of you." A lump rose in his throat. He hadn't known how much he'd needed those words, especially from someone with no reason to say them, no obligation. Here was a near stranger, offering respect not out of duty, but from the heart. A small moment. But to David, it felt like something quietly life-changing. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. They remained together in that moment, surrounded by a calm and reassuring silence. Picking up on his need for something lighter, Claire smoothly shifted the conversation. They began to talk about the city, favorite restaurants, tucked-away corners they each loved, and shared small stories about life's simpler joys. When they finally said goodnight, David had her number saved in his contacts and a tentative plan to meet for coffee the following week. That initial coffee meetup soon led to lunch a few days later, which became weekend strolls along the winding streets of the city. In the months that followed, what began as a casual acquaintance gently transformed into something deeper. There was no urgency, no pressure, just a connection that slowly strengthened. David found himself looking forward to their conversations, appreciating the sparkle in her eyes when she talked about a new art exhibit, and the way she listened, quietly, without judgment, as he slowly peeled back the layers of his past. He wasn't without hesitation. At first, when Claire asked about his ex-wife or the reasons behind his move from New York to Boston, he gave her measured, incomplete answers. But she never pushed. She allowed him to speak when he was ready, and in time, he did. One chilly evening after a movie, they walked side by side along the Charles River. David began to speak, cautiously at first, about the events he'd kept locked away. He offered a rough sketch, the betrayal he endured, the painful choice he was forced to make, and the lingering shame and sorrow that never fully disappeared. Claire said nothing at first. She simply reached out and held his hand, their footsteps in rhythm as they moved through the night. When he finally fell silent, she gently squeezed his hand and said, "You didn't deserve any of that. I'm really glad you told me." There was no pity in her voice, only quiet, heartfelt honesty. In the weeks that followed, that simple gesture of support evolved into longer hugs, into an affection that was healing in its steadiness and care. What blossomed between David and Claire unfolded naturally. It wasn't the whirlwind intensity he'd once felt with Marie. This was something calmer, more grounded, built on truth, patience, and shared understanding. The first time David laughed so hard his sides ached again, it was with Claire, both of them in tears as they botched a too complicated French recipe in her kitchen. The first time he felt the true desire to kiss someone since his life had unraveled. It was on her doorstep after a long walk beneath the night sky. Her kiss was soft and sure, dissolving the final remnants of his fear about letting someone in again. Healing didn't come all at once, of course. There were moments that stirred old fears, like the morning he stumbled across clues to a surprise party Claire was secretly planning for his birthday. For a brief, irrational second, his mind spiraled, equating secrecy with betrayal. He had to consciously remind himself, not every hidden thing was a threat. Claire met those moments with patience. She never pushed. Her unwavering presence, her honesty, her quiet warmth, all reminded him that she was exactly who she appeared to be. Through her, something long fractured within David began to mend. His ability to trust, to believe in goodness again, quietly returned. He became aware of this on a still Sunday afternoon. They were curled up on his couch, each with a book, her legs resting across his lap. Sunlight poured through the window in golden bands. He glanced at her, completely absorbed in her novel, and felt a profound, peaceful certainty. It struck him then. He wanted to share his life with her, not just the easy days, but all of it. No holding back, no fear. In that quiet moment, he knew he'd truly begun to heal. The parts of him that once felt irreparably broken had slowly found their way back to one another. Chapter 10. A Letter Resurfaces. It was a gentle spring afternoon when David sat at his kitchen table, sorting through a modest stack of mail. In the next room, Claire moved about, humming softly as she watered a bright pot of daisies she'd brought to liven up the space. Their life together had settled into a rhythm that David cherished, steady, quiet, and full of comfort. The past, though not forgotten, seemed safely stored away. Or so he thought. Among the usual mix of envelopes, utility bills, catalogs, the usual flood of unsolicited mail, was one that made him go still. A plain white envelope, its return address marked from a correctional facility in upstate New York. His eyes landed on the sender's name, Marie Richardson. His heartbeat quickened. It had been over 2 years since the sentencing. Since then, aside from the paperwork finalizing their divorce, she hadn't reached out, not once. He stared at the envelope, his hand frozen in midair. A part of him wanted to toss it aside, to pretend it had never arrived, to keep that chapter buried deep. But he couldn't help but wonder what it said. In the end, curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, a yearning to truly move on, compelled him to open it. His fingers quivered slightly as he broke the seal and unfolded a single piece of lined paper, covered in Marie's precise and familiar handwriting. The room seemed to pause around him as he began to read, the only sound the faint rustling of the paper. Dear David, I hope this letter finds you well. I realize I'm probably the last person you ever expected or wanted to hear from. And if you decide to stop reading right now, I wouldn't blame you. But if you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for giving me a moment of your attention. There are things I need to put into words, things I may never get the opportunity to say again. So I'm writing now because I have to. And before anything else, I need to say this. I'm sorry. No apology could ever match the weight of the hurt I caused. You offered me your love and your trust, and I betrayed both with lies. I've had countless hours to think about my past, about us, and what I did. There hasn't been a single day that I haven't carried the weight of that regret. When you reported me, I was furious. I felt like you had turned your back on me. But with time, I've come to understand. You did what I couldn't. You had the strength to do what was right, facing the consequences of my actions. It's not something I would have chosen, but maybe in a way, it's what I needed most. In some strange, painful sense, you freed me. You forced me to confront the life I was hiding from. I won't describe the day-to-day reality of prison. It's as bleak and unforgiving as people say, maybe even worse. But I'm doing my best to make the time meaningful. I've joined therapy groups. I even enrolled in a program to study counseling. I don't know what the future holds. I know I can't undo the harm I caused, but I can promise myself I'll never be that same person again. My attorney mentioned you'd moved to Boston. I was relieved to hear that. You needed distance, from the gossip, from the past. You deserved a new beginning. I hope you found a place that gives you peace, surrounded by people who truly value you. I'm not asking for forgiveness, David. I let go of that hope a long time ago. Writing this letter isn't about redemption, it's about acknowledgement. About owning up to the pain I inflicted, and letting you know that remorse lives in me every single day. You once said that true healing starts when we accept responsibility for the harm we've done. Please see this letter as my attempt at that. A small, long overdue step in the right direction. Thank you for the good memories we did share. I still carry them, even though they're overshadowed by the truths I kept from you. You showed me what honest love looks like, even if I didn't live up to it. I am profoundly sorry, David. I truly hope your days are filled with happiness. You deserve that, more than I can ever express. With remorse and gratitude, Marie. As David read the final line, he realized his cheeks were damp with tears. But these weren't the bitter, scorching tears he used to shed. These were quieter, touched with sadness, and to his surprise, the faintest sense of calm. He found himself returning to certain lines again. Maybe it was something I needed. You did the brave right thing. I don't expect you to forgive me. He exhaled shakily. At that moment, Claire entered the room without him noticing, her hand coming to rest gently on his shoulder. Are you all right? She asked softly. He lowered the letter and laid his hand over hers, returning the touch with quiet strength. I think I am, he said, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were true. A small, bittersweet smile began to form. It's from Marie. Claire nodded gently, empathy in her eyes. Do you want to talk about it? He sat in silence for a few heartbeats. Then, slowly, he nodded. They sat together at the kitchen table, their shoulders nearly touching, as David passed the letter to Claire. Their exchange unfolded slowly, rich with emotion and reflection. David didn't hold back. He spoke candidly, sorting through the tangled feelings the letter had stirred, the old pains it unearthed, the unexpected compassion he felt toward Marie's efforts to change, and the unexpected sense of closure it delivered. Claire remained quietly present, her calm support a balm. She said little, but her steady presence said enough. When their conversation finally dwindled into a quiet, mutual silence, David realized that the weight pressing on his chest had eased. With deliberate care, he folded the letter again, pressing the folds flat with his fingers, and slid it back into its envelope. Rather than hiding it away or discarding it, He tucked it gently into a small box with a few keepsakes, pieces of his past acknowledged, no longer aching. In the days that followed, David found himself reflecting on Marie's words. One particular truth she'd written echoed in his thoughts. Forgiveness wasn't something he owed her, and he understood now that full forgiveness might never come. Some hurts cut too deep to vanish completely. Still, he could receive her apology with honesty, and in doing so, let go of the bitterness that had clung to him for too long. Her journey to make amends was hers to walk, and accepting that gave him a sense of peace he hadn't expected. On a clear morning, David and Claire wandered through the park. Blossoms adorned the trees in full bloom, and children chased kites dancing in the breeze. Claire burst into laughter as their aging golden retriever, recently brought into their lives, chased after a kite's shadow across the lawn. David watched her with quiet joy, warmed by the beauty of the simple moment. For the first time in many years, the weight of his past no longer dimmed the present. He had endured the darkest parts of his story, and now he stood in the light, whole again. Claire linked her arm through his, and David felt a deep thankfulness for the long and painful road that had led him to this moment. The truth had demanded a price, but in revealing it, he had been freed. With his past resolved and the horizon open, David stepped forward, ready for whatever the future might hold. Our story has come to an end. What do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the way I tell stories, head over to my channel and check out my other videos. May the force be with you. See you soon, my friend.